Hi, Mike Brantley, auctioneer, here with you today, discussing what is an absolute auction. Well, let's start with this premise. Around the United States, except for the state of Louisiana, every auction is with reserve by default. State law says that. And so if an auctioneer is having an auction on Saturday and there's no specific denoting of the type of auction, it doesn't say it's with reserve or without reserve. What is it? It's with reserve by default, which means, among other things, that the property could have a minimum bid. There could be reserves that are published or unpublished. The seller could be bidding on property to help the prices along. There could be some sort of seller confirmation where the seller accepts or rejects the high bid. There could be court confirmation, government agency confirmation. In other words, things aren't necessarily selling unless the seller or an authorized person says, yes, we are going to sell that for that. That's with reserve. All kinds of ways you can protect property. In fact, with reserve auctions can have one or more of those things. In other words, you could have the seller bidding and reserve the right to accept or reject the high bid. Now, if you're having an absolute auction, there's a phrase that I coined several years ago that I use when auctioneers say, Mike, what really is an absolute auction? State law around the United States, incidentally, calls, for the most part, without reserve auctions compared to with reserve auctions. But the courts have held that a without reserve auction is an absolute auction. Yeah, they're the same thing. In other words, if you say absolute, it's without reserve. If I say it's without reserve, it's absolute. So nonetheless, that phrase, if you're an auctioneer and you're having an absolute auction, a true, genuine, absolute auction, then you are, or your seller has the genuine intent to transfer to the highest bidder, regardless of price. The genuine intent to transfer to the highest bidder, regardless of price. And if you have anything different than that, if there's something else going on, then you're really not having an absolute auction. And let me give you an example. There are companies that advertise absolute auctions, and the bidders walk up and say, I want to register, and they register, and the cashier or registration person says, and I'll need you to write down your opening bid on this form. And the bidder, as I understand, doesn't have any choice. I've got to write down that number or I'm not going to be able to participate today, so I write down the number. And I might even be told when I'm registering, now write down kind of a healthy number here, because obviously our seller isn't going to open this auction unless he sees good evidence that there's sufficient bidding registered or participating today. And what's the problem with that? Well, that's not the genuine intent to transfer to the highest bidder regardless of price. That's the genuine intent, maybe, to transfer to the highest bidder as long as the bidders leave high enough opening bids on their registration forms. Another form of this is selling absolute in theory, and the ring people or representatives of the auctioneers go out in the crowd and canvass. It's called canvassing, and they canvass the crowd and see if they can kind of take the temperature. What are you willing to bid? How high are you willing to go? What's your pre-approval? What's your limit? What do you think this house is worth? And incidentally, that's all fine if that's all you're doing, is just kind of canvassing for your own information. But if you're using that information prior to the start of the auction to then sit down with your seller and say, it doesn't look like we got it today. I don't think the people are here. I don't think the right people are here. It doesn't look like they're going to pay enough. Let's cancel the auction, because you can cancel an absolute auction if you don't put the item up. And I suppose you could, when would you invoke that rightly so? If you held an absolute auction and there's only one person standing there or two people standing there, you might say, well, we just don't have enough bidders. You didn't ask them anything. You just looked out there and counted. 1, 2, I don't think we're having this auction today, folks. And you cancel it. And what I was discussing prior to that, there could be 19 people registered, but we're still not going to open it up because they're not really giving us enough assurance that they're going to pay the price we need. Well, those people shouldn't be selling absolute. They should be selling with reserve. And because that's not, again, that's not the genuine intent to transfer to the highest bidder regardless of price. Lastly, two things here. One, with reserve auctions can get a crowd, can get people there, can get good prices if auctioneers don't try to start where they want to finish. You can't start where you want to finish. You can't have a $250,000 house with a minimum bid of $240,000. I mean, you can, but you're not going to have anybody show up because, well, if I wanted to pay $240,000 for a $250,000 house, there's all kinds of ways to do that. I don't have to attend your auction. If I've got a $250,000 house, what I believe is a $250,000 real property, and the minimum bid's $100,000, well, it's academic. And if it's academic, then it's like an absolute auction. It's not an absolute auction, but it's like an absolute auction. And that people are going to show up and say, well, I don't know who wants to go first here, but we don't have anybody registered not willing to give $100,000 for a $250,000 property. It would beg the question why the minimum is there at all. I would think you would get even more people by saying this is absolute and sells regardless of price. You might get a few more people there than $100,000 minimum bid. And I would say, and it's 2020 here, that auctioneers who are disclosing the minimum bid are finding that the public responds to that better than I can't tell you what the minimum bid is, because people are busy and you got a buyer call you up and say, what's the minimum bid? I'm interested in that house, I'm interested in that farm, I'm interested in that ranch, I'm interested in that golf course. What's the minimum bid? Well, I can't tell you. I can't tell you. What do you mean you can't tell me? Everything else in my life has a price on it. Why doesn't that have a price on it? Well, it has a price. We think it's worth about $4 million. So it has to bring $4 million. No, that's not the minimum bid. Will they sell for any less than $4 million? Yeah, they'd take less than 4. How much less? Well, I can't tell you. Well, you're not attracting people to that event. Now, if it's a $4 million ranch and the minimum bid's $3 million or $2 million or something like that, they say, yeah, I'd pay $2 million. I'd pay 50 cents on the dollar, and they'll show up. So disclosure, largely, the concept of disclosing the minimum bid, if it's good news, attracts attention, or absolute attracts attention. Here's what doesn't attract attention, incidentally. Not disclosing, or minimum bids that are too high, because that just discourages participation. And otherwise, we talked about seller bidding or confirmation or minimum bids and all that kind of stuff in a with reserve auction. You can't have any of that in an absolute auction. Well, you can. If the auction is a forced sale in that the seller did not consent to the sale, or maybe didn't even have knowledge of the sale, foreclosures, repossession, court-ordered lien, storage lien, and the like, well, then the seller can bid. Even if it's selling absolute, the seller can bid to protect their interest. And I think that's a reasonable rule. So absolute auctions tend to get more money, tend to get more people, tend to get more interest. But if your seller isn't prepared to sell to the highest bidder, regardless of price, an absolute auction is not a good fit. And they should be selling with reserve. And they can have a reasonable minimum bid of some sort. That's where you start. It's not necessarily where you finish. And they can have success. But mixing the two or saying it's absolute when it's not absolute is a travesty, is awful. It's awful because auctioneers who truly sell absolute are confused with auctioneers in the public's eye with auctioneers that advertise absolute, and they are not selling absolute. So if you're not selling absolute, don't advertise it absolute. Don't say it's without reserve or similar language. It's not good for the industry. It's not good for us auctioneers, me included, that sells a lot of things absolute, and I really mean it. We genuinely do. So what's an absolute auction? The genuine intent to transfer to the highest bidder regardless of price. Mike Brantley, auctioneer. Pleasure to be with you here today. Check in for more videos. Have a great day and stay safe.